Hello, my name is Chinmoy Banerjee. I'm the president of South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy. And on behalf of that organization, Sansad, I have the greatest pleasure in welcoming you. Thank you so much for coming out. Transit strike and all that, and terrible traffic, but here we are. Many of us have been really looking forward to this event. It's my pleasure also to thank my co-organizers, sponsors of this event. First of all, David Lamb Center and the School of International Studies and Institute for the Humanities, and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Simon Fraser University, Center for India and South Asia Research, the Department of Anthropology, the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and the Institute for Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. And I'm so glad that Sarah is here to represent UBC. And this event is supported by the Indian Summer Festival, whom I also thank. And it is then my great honor to welcome and thank Alpa Shah for coming out all the way from England with a little baby whom she had to leave to come and talk to us, and also my supreme honor, great honor, to thank Professor Emeritus John Harris for coming all the way from Kingston, Ontario, here, Vancouver, to be with us and to agree to moderate this event. Professor Harris has written any number of books and articles, but I'll mention only a few that I find particularly relevant. One is depoliticizing development. Another is reinventing India, liberalization, Hindu nationalism, and popular democracy, India today, and a forthcoming book that I'm greatly looking forward to, India, Unity and Change in the 21st Century, which I'm told will be coming out in the middle of next year, and I look forward to reading that. I'll conclude that by saying that Alpa Shah's book, Nightmarch, is absolutely delightful. I have totally enjoyed it, and I strongly recommend that you get it immediately and start reading it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chin. Lovely. So, Chin, thank you very much for that introduction. Myself, it's just very nice to be kind of back home in Vancouver. Before I begin, I think I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I worry a little bit about the language which is used in these acknowledgements. I sometimes think we should just be honest about it and say we're on land which was taken from these peoples. But these are the lands that we are on. I'm really very, very happy, and also, if I may say, proud to welcome Alpa Shah here tonight, to welcome her to Vancouver and to Simon Fraser University. I mean, I'm happy because Alpa has been a very good friend for a good many years. And I'm proud because I had the privilege of teaching her as a graduate student at the London School of Economics a good many years ago now. And Alpa is, of course, now a professor of anthropology at the LSE. I think what distinguishes Alpa above all, through all her work, is that she is a very fine ethnographer. You find in her work rich ethnography. And that is combined with scrupulous critical scholarship and passionate political commitment. Her work is driven by a sense of purpose, of wanting to understand, to explain, but driven by a sense of concern about the directions in which our societies are moving. These concerns are reflected in two books which she has published just in the last 18 months or so. The first of them, called Ground Down by Growth, is actually the product of a very remarkable sort of collaborative project in which Alpa brought together 5 young anthropologists and with a colleague, Jens Lercher, from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, developed a program of work in which the 5 young anthropologists went back to field sites they know quite well, widely spread across India, and have developed really an analysis of the condition, above all, I think, of the conditions of labour in different parts of the country, showing up the extent to which people, migrants often of tribal origin, are subject to super exploitation in the context of India's very rapid economic growth. Ground Down by Growth is a very evocative title. And the second book is the one that Alpa will be talking about tonight, Nightmarch, which is an account, yes, literally, of a night march that she undertook, as she will explain, with a group of India's Maoists. The Alpa first encountered India's Maoists, those who at one time still are referred to as Naxalites, whilst she was doing her PhD research in a part of the East Indian state of Jharkhand. I think it was towards the end, if I remember correctly, of that period of fieldwork that Maoists started to penetrate the area in which Alpa was working. She went back some years later and spent 2 years doing field work in an area in which, Alpa, I may not say this, or I won't say this as well as you do, but an area in which the Maoist movement is sort of interwoven into local society. And it was as a result of that experience that she found herself on this night march from a part of Bihar back into Jharkhand. And as you'll hear, and as some of you I'm sure will read, through the account of the march, of people she meets, she develops a very powerful analysis of the character of the Indian Maoist movement. It's an analysis which is at once sympathetic but also critical. So it is a truly remarkable piece of work in my view, and I, like all of us, look forward, Alpa, to hearing more about it just now. Lovely. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks so much, John, for this such generous, lovely introduction, which, I'm quite moved by. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much to Chen for being so enthusiastic and coordinating the whole event and insisting that it should happen and making it happen, and to the David Lamb Centre and UBC for supporting it and hosting it, and all those various institutions in Vancouver who have come together to make this possible, to make it possible for me to be here tonight to tell you about some of the stories of what's going on in Central and Eastern India. What I will tell you about happened, the stories emerged from 2008 to 2010, but they are still as alive as ever right now. So I'll launch straight into this book, Nightmarch. Deep in the forested hills of Jharkhand, one freezing December night in 2008, I made my way past 3 sentry posts to a solitary mud hut which was set aside from the rest of the village. The soft-spoken, slightly balding, middle-aged man inside went by a nom de guerre, Gyanji. Like the guerrilla platoon outside that was guarding their leader, Gyanji was dressed in an olive green fatigue, carried all his worldly belongings in one small rucksack. But in the dim light spreading from the kerosene lamp, I noticed the tender soles of his light-skinned feet. He had been constantly on the move in the rural backwaters of India, often sleeping under the stars in the forest. Rarely did he stay for more than a night or two in one place. Hi, come, please. We're right in the forests right now. Make yourselves comfortable.
Yes. You find your way amongst the trees.
There's more seats down here. But in contrast to Gyanji's tender souls, were those of the tribal soldiers that were guarding his hut outside, layered with years' worth of skin which made them as tough, dry, and cracked as the red earth they had walked barefoot since they were born. Gyanji's were still soft from the childhood care and protection they had received in his parents' upper caste home. In those hills where the local tongue of Nagpuria rang through the forests like song, and even India's majority language, Hindi, stood out like a rarity, Gyanji's polished English was quite remarkable. He could recite Shelley and Shaw. He had a master's degree in mathematics. His siblings included a bank employee, an accountant, and a computer scientist who had emigrated here to Canada. It was only Gyanji who had gone astray from the upper middle class path laid out by his parents. Inspired by the revolutionary spirit in the universities around him and by the peasant rebellions that had been sweeping through India in the 3 decades before, aged 24, Gyanji cut ties with his family and he took the oath of becoming what is called a professional revolutionary. He joined a group of men and women who had renounced the comforts of their homes and their university classrooms, and they declassed, that's what they call it, declassed themselves, and they decasted themselves. And in a very long tradition of Marxism, Leninism, they resolved to fight oppression, injustice, and inequality to make a more humane world. Today, these people call themselves the Communist Party of India, Maoist. They're also known as the Naxalites or Maoists, and they're leading what is now probably the longest ongoing armed revolutionary movement. These Naxalite rebels have haunted and taunted the Indian state for at least the last 50 years. Their foot soldiers today, for the People's Liberation Army, come mainly from India's tribal communities, who are popularly called Adivasi. They make up 8.6% of the total population of India, accounting for more than 100 million people. They've been considered historically to be so lowly and savage and wild by the dominant castes and classes that for centuries they were left on the margins of Indian society. They survived in the jungles by cultivating whatever little land they had, living off forest resources by hunting and gathering fruits and flowers, chopping wood to build their homes, fuel their hearths and make their plows and digging sticks. They were able to reproduce themselves through the resources they found around them without much dependence on the rest of Indian society. And because of this, many of these Adivasi communities could develop social values and countercultures that were actually very different to most of the rest of Indian society. They were remarkably egalitarian and ecologically sound compared to the very hierarchical dominant castes and classes, especially of the plains surrounding them. Today, these communities are increasingly squeezed out of their forest homes by the state and by corporations. They migrate for a few months of the year far away from their homes to construction sites, factories in towns and cities in faraway places. There they are used for the cheapest and most grueling of work, the most backbreaking, the most hazardous labor, providing the cheap labor that is fueling the Indian economic boom. These Adivasi foot soldiers were often fighting for very different reasons from the abstract ideals of leaders like Gyanji. On a wider level, theirs is a struggle for autonomy against the state that they see as repressive, brutal, and prejudiced. But for any individual Adivasi, their reasons for joining the Naxalites were often much more personal. Take, for example, Kohli, a gentle 16-year-old Adivasi youth with radiant dark skin and a coy smile, whose rifle was nearly as tall as himself when he was assigned my bodyguard. He insisted on carrying my bags. He had run away to live with the guerrillas after a trivial fight with his father about a glass of spilt milk, literally a glass of spilt milk, while working in his tea shop. Rather than breaking with their pasts, as Gyanji did, these Adivasi youth often found in the guerrilla armies another home, a home away from home. They often moved in and out of them as though they were visiting an uncle or an aunt. To the government in New Delhi, though, both Gyanji and Kohli are simply terrorists, a dangerous cancer that must be eradicated. The insurgents have blown up security forces. They have derailed trains that defy their blockades. They have killed people that they deem are police informers. And they have delivered summary justices in their people's courts. Reporting these latest incidents, news bands reading, terrorist attack or latest terrorist court regularly appear across national TV channels, creating a climate of fear amongst the Indian middle classes, for whom large sections of rural central and eastern India are no-go zones. 2 years ago, the then Home Minister Rajnath Singh promised the final battle against the Naxalites to be fought to the finish and won. We need to bring aggression into our policy, aggression into thinking, aggression in our strategy, aggression in the deployment of forces, aggression in operations, aggression in development, and aggression in road construction, he said. 4 days ago, the current Home Minister, Amit Shah, has renewed this resolve. He's asked the Central Reserve Police Forces to mobilize against urban Naxals. The latest Indian government campaigns against the rebels began over a decade ago. In 2006, the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh declared the Maoists the greatest internal security threat facing the country and labeled them terrorists. This signaled a new wave of security operations to hunt down the Maoists and to silence their sympathizers and supporters. A red corridor was painted right up from Nepal in the north down to Andhra in the south, and the intelligence agencies at one point claimed that 40% of India's land area was affected. Now, of course, all these numbers are very hard to verify and possibly also inflated to justify an increase in security and defense budgets. But more than 100,000 soldiers were dispatched to surround the Maoist guerrilla strongholds in the center and east of the country. They were accompanied by squadrons of helicopters, special forces with exotically implausible names such as Cobra or Jharkhand Jaguar, Greyhounds, and they were all trained in jungle warfare schools to fight the guerrilla with their own tactics. In some areas, such as the Dandakaranya region of Chhattisgarh, local youth were armed and mobilized to cleanse the area of people in what was called the Salva Judam, which is literally meant the purification hunt in the local Gondi language. Entire villages were plundered and burnt down. Children were thrown into fires, pregnant women were killed, hundreds of women were raped, others mutilated, murdered, and according to human rights activists, more than 350,000 people were forced to leave their homes. Many forcibly evacuated into these resettlement camps, which they often considered were more like prison compounds. Human rights activists and scholars have argued that behind the state's desire to destroy the Naxalites and civilize the Adivasis is the aim of actually cleansing the area of people for the extraction of minerals. So, under these Adivasi forests in the states of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, lie some of India's greatest mineral resources, most lucrative ones: coal, iron ore, bauxite, copper, manganese, mica, there's more. Business analysts have claimed that the Indian mining story is a success in waiting. Powerful corporations have signed deals to exploit the resources and to acquire land for mining operations, steel factories, power plants. Mittal, Essar, Vedanta, Rio Tinto, POSCO, you name them, they're all scouting out the landscape. But the historic laws which the Adivasis fought for in colonial times prevent their lands from being easily sold to non-Adivasis, to outsiders. So the Adivasis and the Naxalites who live among them stand squarely in the way of India's boom. In the villages where I lived among the guerrillas, the security forces' search and destroy missions generated terror. Those who could fled to neighboring villages as the patrols mounted the hills. Villages had been used as human shields by the security forces and as informers to find the Maoists. Others had been caught in the crossfire and brutally beaten by soldiers during raids, accused of harboring rebels. Like the Vietnam War, generals boast of better kill ratios. At least 7,000 people lost their lives in the last decade. The government has pledged many times in the past to destroy the Maoists, but yet they endure. Every year in November, across the forest that are their strongholds, the Maoists celebrate the deceased in the Martyrs' Week. The meetings of guerrillas and clearings in the forest lined with crepe pepper bunting and memorials draped in red cloth are all ephemeral, as traces of them have to be removed almost as soon as they've been erected in order to evade the security forces. Nevertheless, they still fly their red flags painted with a hammer and a sickle. They sing the Socialist Internationale, and in remembering the thousands that have been killed, they seek to regenerate life in the revolutionary spirit from the dead. These traditions go back to their origins. They first made their mark in the Indian countryside in May 1967. Then there was a small uprising in the foothills of the Himalayas in the West Bengal village called Naxalite, from which they get their name. Peasants and laborers occupied lands, reclaimed it as theirs, demanded that the landlords cancelled all their debts and ended intergenerational bondage. The Chinese Communist Party at the time broadcast these Naxalbari events widely on Peking radio. They announced the establishment of a red area of rural revolutionary armed struggle, declaring that a peal of spring thunder had crashed over India. But within a few months, the uprising was brutally crushed by the police, and many of the leaders were killed or imprisoned. Nevertheless, the embers of the rebellion ignited sparks in other parts of the country, in Srikakulam, in Andhra Pradesh, in Koraput, in Orissa, in the plains of Bhojpur in Bihar, in Birbhum in West Bengal. The leaders of these different rebellions formed different revolutionary parties. They claimed that India needed the strategy that Mao Zedong had used against the Japanese in the 1930s, when conditions in China were apparently also semi-colonial and semi-feudal. They began plans for a protracted people's war, mobilizing peasants to establish rural bases and eventually, over time, encircle the cities to capture state power in the fight for a global communist society. Now, drawn by the romance of this movement, many bright urban youth from urban and middle class caste and class families basically renounced the comforts of their homes and their university classrooms to come to work with the poor. Gyanji, who once in fact meditated alone for his nirvana on the banks of the Ganges, found kindred spirits amongst teachers and fellow students. They discussed and debated how to bring heaven on earth, how to create a communist society. They linked hands with the protests against the Vietnam War, the uprisings in Paris, and the rise of the American Black Panthers, and they distributed pamphlets on the death of God. Fired by the passions of those who had taken to the streets and challenged the injustices of governments in faraway places, moved by the poverty and oppression in the slums on their doorsteps, they were disenchanted by the corruption of party politics and the failure of the Indian state to address inequality. The agricultural plains of Bihar, where Gyanji initially worked in the late 80s, became known as India's flaming fields due to the fierce caste wars that were fought between the Naxalites, their supporters, and the dominant caste landlords. One of the poorest areas of India, the region was marked by great disparities between the high caste landlords who controlled large swathes of land and the smaller farmers, and especially the landless Dalits who worked for the landowners and were considered untouchables. The Naxalites tried to infiltrate the Dalit households to free them from their servitude. They selectively killed the most oppressive landlords, chased away others to the cities, seized their land, and redistributed it amongst the landless and small farmers. They organized rallies, they organized protests, they organized labor strikes, demanding labor wage rises. They demanded for the elimination of bonded labor, more equitable terms for sharecropping. They beat men publicly who had sexually harassed working women, They descended en masse into government offices to demand clean drinking water, better housing and healthcare provision. But in the 1990s, state repression increased, and the high caste landlords retaliated against the Naxalites and their supporters by forming private armies or militias, which went by the names such as Ranveer Sena or Bhumi Sena, Sunlight Sena. These Senas, armies, came with their own war cry. There is only one remedy for the Naxalites, they said: cut them 6 inches shorter. Dalits in particular were massacred overnight. They were often decapitated as the slogan promised to make them 6 inches shorter. Men, women and children were killed, 8 one night, 9 another, 22 another, 25, 35, so the growing slaughter continued as the police watched on. Then the houses of Naxalite supporters were burnt to the ground. There was nowhere to hide. The guerrillas could no longer take shelter in the mud houses, and the rice fields provided safety only when the crop was tall. So what did they do? They read their Mao Zedong, they read their Che Guevara, and they hoped to find India's Yan'an. They went in search of better geographical terrain for guerrilla warfare, and they began to retreat into the hills and forests of central and eastern India, into the states of what is now Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, into southern Orissa, northern Andhra Pradesh, southeast Maharashtra, and parts of West Bengal. At the time, the Naxalite leaders, who came from the cities and had experience mainly of the agricultural plains, they actually knew very little about the tribal people that had dominated these forested highlands. The communities of Urals, the Mundas, the Hors, the Paharias, the Gons, the Birhors, many other Adivasi groups. Though the modern state with the British East India Company, followed by the government under the British Crown, and then the Indian independent government had penetrated these areas, it was mainly for taxation and exploitation of the forests for military purposes, for railway sleepers and for furniture. For the Adivasis, the state was the policeman who beat you, the officials who cordoned off your forest and let outsiders steal your timber, and soldiers who drove you like animals. The term used for Adivasis by many officers was jungli, savage. When the Naxalites arrived, addressing local grievances, they chased away the forest and police officials, they set up mobile health camps, and they gained credibility amongst the locals. Although the Naxalites were, in fact, as foreign to the Adivasis as the officials, the state officials, they treated the Adivasis with a respect and dignity that they hadn't experienced from those officials. So they gained a legitimacy and an intimacy with local communities. And over time, they were able to establish kinship links between the guerrilla armies and the villagers, making it very easy over time for youth like Kohli to move back and forth between the guerrilla armies and the villages. So by the time I ended up living in the guerrilla strongholds, in fact, almost every Adivasi household had or knew someone who was involved as an armed cadre, worker or sympathizer, and the Maoists themselves were called the Jungle Sarkar, the forest state. In the 6 years after I left, the South Asia Terrorism Portal claims that over 6,000 people have surrendered and more than 5,000 have been arrested. The government offered handsome monetary packages up to, 1.7 lakh, 2.5 lakh, this is all like 1,700 pounds, 2,800 pounds. I don't know how much that converts into Canadian currency, but more for weapons. Sorry, how much was that?
4,000.
Okay, yeah. And this all, of course, all depends on the seniority of the leadership and what kind of arms they're going to come with. Scholars, lawyers, and human rights activists have said that, of course, many of these surrenders are fake, that Adivasis have been coerced. And this is, of course, a new history to a long story of fakes. fake incidents. Rebels have been presented as killed in battle when they have actually died under police torture. But verification of events is very tough. The few brave independent reporters, human rights lawyers, and activists that have entered the affected regions have been chased out. I crossed paths with the guerrillas when, as John mentioned, towards the end of my doctoral field research. That was in 1999 to 2002. They were starting to enter the Munda Adivasi village where I lived then. At the time, I saw them as protection racketeers, not unlike the Sicilian mafia. They were extorting money from state development schemes and big business in return for safeguarding against their own violence. But as I followed their progress from London, I became intrigued by the fact that so many Adivasis seemed to be joining them, and I felt compelled to understand why. So I knew I had to return to Jharkhand to conduct ethnographic research, that hallmark praxis of social anthropology, which is participant observation, where you have an extremely deep immersion over a long period of time, at least a year or more, where you live with the people whose lives you want to understand, people who are initially strangers to you. You learn their local language, you seek to know and experience the world through their perspectives and actions. And you do that in as holistic a manner as possible. So, you're not there just to follow a story, a target-driven story like a journalist would. You're there to follow your nose, really. You're there to understand religion, politics, economics, how all of these different things tie up together. Undertaking such long, open-ended field research seemed really crucial in order to move beyond the cursory impressions based on interviews or a few-day visits that had begun emerging on the Maoists. Staying in the Adivasi communities in a guerrilla stronghold seemed the obvious way to arrive at a much more nuanced understanding of their predicament than those that had emerged of comparable contexts, whether it was the Vietnam War or Peru's Shining Path insurrection, where the common arguments that are made is that people are stuck between two armies, or they're coerced into revolutionary support, or they're turned to the guerrillas because of either some utilitarian benefits or some kind of long-standing grievances that are being addressed by the guerrillas. But it was not until 2008, which coincidentally was at the time of the counter-insurgency operations when they began, when they were launched by the Indian state, that I was finally able to return to Jharkhand. I went with very modest ambitions. I wanted to spend some time among the Adivasis to understand what life was like for them, how it had changed in the face of this so-called revolutionary movement, allegedly one that was fighting for a more equal society. I never expected to see a guerrilla, let alone meet one, but I had by chance ended up living in what the Naxalites considered their red capital, one of the two guerrilla strongholds in India. As the state counterinsurgency operations escalated, outsiders were prohibited from entering the guerrilla areas unless they were accompanied by the security forces. Those who dared to venture in without informing the authorities rarely stayed more than a few hours, a few days at the most. As the situation became increasingly dangerous, I considered returning to London. But the stories of the people I met in the Red Capital already pulled me too far into this little-known world. So Nightmarch refers to this unexpected 7-night trek with a Naxalite guerrilla platoon undertaken in 2010, which was towards the end of my research. It was alongside this new intensive counterinsurgency operations when I found myself dressed as a man in an olive green uniform, the only woman and the only non-combatant. I set out with a group of fighters under the cover of darkness to walk 250 kilometers from one part of India in Bihar to another in Jharkhand. Now, unraveling across this march, the book draws actually on the 4.5 years that I have lived as an anthropologist amidst India's Adivasi people, with one long spell outside the guerrilla stronghold and another within. Nightmarch is then my journey into this underbelly of the subcontinent to understand why, behind the mask of this shining new India, some of the country's poorest people shunned the world's largest democracy, and they were united with revolutionary ideologues to take up arms against rising inequality. So the book focuses on both the perspectives of the revolutionary ideologues like Gyanji and the poor Adivasi communities who were joining them. So at the heart of the book are the nuances, complexities and ironies of this protracted encounter between leaders and foot soldiers. So the book tells a story of the very different kinds of people I met along the way, how they came together to take up arms, to change the world, but also how they fell apart, how their dreams turned into nightmares. So there is, for instance, Gyanji, who is the archetypal high caste intellectual from a well-to-do family who had been underground for more than, now 30 years. Kohli, the 16-year-old Adivasi foot soldier who flees in and out of the guerrilla armies as though he was going to stay with an uncle or an aunt. But there's also Vikas, who is the Adivasi youth, who is the platoon commander of the platoon I marched with, who ends up betraying the guerrillas, forming a gang out to destroy them. And there is Somvari, the Adivasi woman who I lived with, who grows eventually to resent the guerrillas. So through these characters, who are kind of archetypal characters, and my journey with them, Nightmarch shows how, amidst all these proliferating contradictions, revolutionary motivations are being sustained and subverted at the same time. And this is, of course, all against a backdrop of exploitation, inequality, and injustice that stays within, is here right now within the heart of contemporary India. What I'd like to do is a short reading from the book, and then before I end, I'll just give you a glimpse of some of the main points I bring out through the book. So let me just read a little section of the book. So this is right towards the end of the march, almost the final night. I was awoken for the roll call at 10 p.m. Gyanji assured me that this really was the last leg of the journey. We would not walk for much more than 4 hours across the plains before we would be in the safety of the forests not far from Lalgaon. So Lalgaon is a place where I had lived for the previous 1.5 years, which was the guerrilla stronghold. One foot in front of the other. Then there was a sudden jerk in my neck. The weight of my head had collapsed onto my chest. I realized I had dozed off while walking and awoke with a jolt. My eyelids were heavy and I struggled to keep my eyes open as we marched on. My neck jerked again and then again. Sleepwalking is what the guerrillas called it. They could all do it. I used to laugh in disbelief when they told me about it in the months before. not once imagining that I would share their lives to such an extent that I would find myself walking in my sleep as they did. I had never experienced it before. My head seemed to empty of all consciousness, and awareness moved to my feet, which continued to put themselves one in front of the other with mechanical regularity. They intuitively appeared to sense the unevenness of the ground beneath them without recourse to the eyes or the brain. 4 hours later, it was obvious that something was wrong. We ought to have been surrounded by the forest by then. Gyanji had been uneasy for most of the previous hour. It became clear that we were not on the route that they normally took through this area. Moreover, there were now 2 new CRPF, that's the Central Reserve Police Force, camps, with at least 1,000 men of the security forces stationed in these plains, all trained as commandos in counter-terrorism and jungle warfare tactics. They were there to conduct domination exercises, to sanitize the area and get rid of the guerrillas by going out on regular patrols and setting up ambushes. Vikas was leading us. He kept running back when Gyanji beckoned him, bringing assurances that everything was under control and that the pilots up ahead were on the right track. But clearly something was amiss. I was rather annoyed with Gyanji. He seemed to be taking too lenient an attitude towards Vikas. Did Vikas know where he was going? Was he deliberately leading us astray? Wasn't this exactly how ambushes were set up? We seemed to be sitting ducks. Parasji, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to my concerns about Vikas. Noticing my struggle to keep up, he suggested that I should ride the horse. So this horse had kind of joined us on the last night, another long story. I tried to protest, afraid to lose control of my mobility to an animal, but he insisted. I was too tired to hold my ground. In any case, I wasn't sure I was the best judge of what was good for me at that stage, and so I gave in. The saddle was a pile of blankets, and the stirrups were 2 loopholes knotted into a jute rope. It was far from comfortable, but lolling up and down on the animal certainly kept me awake. An ear-splitting bang resounded through the landscape. The horse bolted away from the line. With my heart in my mouth, I dug my calves into its side and tugged ineffectually at the reins for a few seconds, and then wrapped my arms around the horse's neck, hanging on for dear life. Just as I was about to free my feet of the stirrups, there was another boom. Kohli ran to my side, grabbed the reins, and brought the spooked horse to a halt before helping me dismount. "Run!" people were shouting. Kohli said, "Let's go, Didi," and so I ran, trying to keep up with him. Earlier on in the night, when I had been constantly on the brink of falling asleep as I walked, I wouldn't have believed that I was capable of running at all. I hadn't known that when you think that you have a gang of armed men after you, you find the strength to run. I was half sick with fright. I passed others who had stopped in their tracks to fling themselves onto the ground and crouch down behind the rice buns. Some of them appeared to be crawling on their bellies towards what looked like the contours of reeds. I wondered whether I should follow suit. I couldn't keep up with Kohli, and he disappeared from my sight. Then I heard the voices of North Indian soldiers, and although I didn't know if they were imagined or real, and although I didn't know where I was going, it galvanized me into running faster. "Everyone back in line," I heard Gyanji and then Parasji shouting. "Stop running! Calm down! Don't disperse!" Parasji's voice rang through the air. They said it was only a shotgun, probably a hunter in the jungle or someone just practicing their shooting. The Indian security forces, they assured us, would not be out now. I stopped running. Guerrillas emerged from all sides like ghosts. A company line was formed again. But after the recent panic, the line kept breaking. It seemed that everyone's nerves were frayed. Soldiers were huddled together and the space between groups kept increasing. It was hard to keep 80 people together, and we soon became a ragtag bunch of misfits roaming the landscape. Gyanji was in despair as he said we were losing discipline when we needed it the most. It was as though the gun had shot through everyone's confidence in the guerrilla army. I never discovered what the gunshot was, but I grew increasingly frustrated with Gyanji for not taking Vikas to task and for not taking on the responsibility to lead the company himself. So many lives were at stake now. However, I was too shaken to speak and focused my energies back on placing my feet one in front of the other. It must have been 5 o'clock in the morning when we entered a patch of forest. We were to rest there for no more than 10 minutes. Yet bags were thrown onto the ground and people collapsed onto whatever clearing was closest to them. There was no attempt to keep any kind of military formation. Within minutes, it looked like most of the 80-odd crew was fast asleep. I wondered how people could sleep under such stressful conditions. I sat beside Gyanji, fully aware that he was aghast that everyone had just dropped off to sleep. I knew that having stopped, everyone would now find it extremely hard to restart walking again. With such exhaustion, it was more important than ever to keep the rhythm of the march going. I said to myself that under no circumstances must I allow my eyes to close, although my eyelids were like a lead weight that wouldn't stop sinking. So, just to give you a flavor of some of the main analysis that emerges as told through the characters in the book and as takes place over the course of the march. You know, the spread, as I said, of such insurgencies is usually explained in terms of ordinary people being caught between the state and the rebels because they're stuck between two armies, or they're joining the rebel cause because of utilitarian benefits they provide, you know, the greed argument, or because of the genuine problems of the people they address, you know, what is commonly called the grievance argument. Now, Nightmarch argues, you know, shows through the stories that these explanations are actually partial at best. What it shows is the significance of the development of emotional intimacy, family and kinship networks between the rebel armies and the villagers, which both enabled the spread of the insurgents, but also became their Achilles heel, undermining their activities. So these Naxalites, as I said, they came as dominant caste outsiders, but really they had this ideological commitment to an egalitarian society, you know, which came from their ideal of a communist utopia, a casteless and classless one. And that translated into their humane treatment of those they encountered with dignity as equal human beings. So communism wasn't simply this kind of utopian ideal of a future society, but it influenced the way in which they treated each other, the ways in which revolutionary subjectivity was formed, and how relations, you know, social relations were structured in the areas where the party held sway. So an enormous effort was spent into superseding and negating the specificities of caste and class divisions between those who encountered the revolutionaries. And it is this that encouraged the development of relations of intimacy between the Naxalites and the Adivasis. So that's one of the arguments that's key to the book. But there are also other issues which are important. And you know, one of the suggestions I make is that revolutionary communists in India are kind of comparable to its religious renouncers. Though one seeks personal emancipation, the religious ascetic, the other works for communal freedom, both have renounced the comforts of the world around them, broken with their pasts, and sacrificed everything, including themselves, to fight for their ideals of human emancipation. I also argue that the Naxalites, you know, they hang on to this outdated analysis of the Indian economy. They say it is semi-feudal, and this analysis has basically gained some kind of untouchable status, a kind of transcendental purity within the movement, almost as though it's a religious mantra. And it's probably one reason why a small group of leaders have managed to stay together over this long period of time and stuck together against all odds, but it's also created several problems for their aims of social transformation, because they're not able to account for the way in which capitalism has spread across the countryside, and its values have seeped into everyday life in the country, including within their own armies, creating renegades. So renegades like Vikas, for example, who in the end, you find this getting corrupt from the movement, taking away money from the movement for his personal pocket, and in the end actually becomes, forms a gang out to kill the Naxalite leaders. So they also, another big argument I make is that the Naxalites fail to see the egalitarian practices of the Adivasis as they already existed amongst the Adivasi villages, and in fact this failure to see the kind of society they lived amidst leads to the demise of those values within that society. So so there's their inability to sticking to this like outdated analysis of the Indian economy comes at great cost because of the failure to recognize the processes that are at shape, right in front of them. I also argue that mobilizing people to fight against inequality and injustice may sometimes require the use of arms, but violent resistance will attract the violence of state repression, and that the danger is that mastering the art and discipline of guns becomes the focus of your humanitarian struggle. And this is what happens, to the Naxalites when, over time, it became a movement that had to, by the time I was there, they could not focus on political education amongst the masses. Their main focus was trying to survive with their arms. And so these other efforts of mobilizing people more widely, it gains a it's put on hold. But also the other danger is that you start reproducing, the violence of your oppressor, so you become as violent as the people that you're trying to actually oppose. What I end up arguing in the book is that some of the most sophisticated explanations of the appeal of the Naxalites have suggested that they are the combined outcome of a steady democratization of the political process in India and the failure of its developmental reach. So as the state has become more and more available to people on the ground and people who've been kept on its margins, more of India's marginalized people have participated in its democratic processes, democratic aspirations have flourished. But at the same time, the failure of Indian democracy to give adequate space in which a sense of justice and purpose can be articulated has left vast sections of the society disenchanted, and their grievances have made them turn to the Naxalite. So this is one of the main things that's argued by some of the most sophisticated analysts. What I argue in Nightmarch is that in fact the opposite is true, that this movement, which is fighting against the character of Indian democracy, has in fact expanded mainstream Indian democracy amongst the people who had previously been left on its margins, alienated from it. So by fighting through the Naxalites, by fighting for their human rights on an equal footing with dominant and higher castes and classes, the Naxalites have basically, over time, nurtured Dalits, the Dalits and Adivasis, who ultimately will not seek a withering away of the Indian state, that is the revolutionary ideal of the Naxalites, but it will actually want a greater share of the state as a part of it. So, communist struggles which seek to create new casteless, classless communities where women will be equal to men, but are most often led by men from elite backgrounds. In their challenge to these structural inequalities of society, they too often neglect the incipient inequalities that are within. In India, the result may be that this kind of Maoist-inspired Naxalite struggle for a communist society will have given rise to stronger, emboldened Dalit, Adivasi and women's movements who are demanding to be treated on equal terms as dominant classes and castes. They're seeking an equal share of the space within Indian democracy, keeping alive a dream for a better, more equal world. So perhaps then one of the most furthest reaching consequences of this movement might have been as a democratizing force in India, catalyzing those who want to fight for a more equal world, who are mobilized by the spirit of the revolutionary struggle, even if they have been at the same time disappointed and disillusioned by its practices. So yeah, I mean, I end with giving you, this argument is made in different ways through the book, but it's made it's made through the stories of Kohli, Vikas, Somvari, and over the course of the march. So anyway, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think before just asking everyone here to put their questions to you, Alpa, I think I'd just sort of add, I think you did bring this out in the way in which you spoke towards the end, but I think I'm not alone in feeling, coming towards the, I don't know whether you felt this, Chin, but coming towards the end of the book, I feel a very profound sense of sadness, because I think you present to me so very well. On one hand, the idealism, the hope of so many of these guys, and yet the project is so deeply flawed that the hopes are all the time sort of undermined, and I come away feeling profoundly sad. Anyway, and thank you too for making those points that you did about the analysis that the Maoists are so committed to of India as semi-colonial, semi-feudal. I think it is very, very important that there is such a strong sort of commitment to that analysis, and how deeply flawed really it seems, I think, to many of us now to be. Anyway, Alpa, I know, will be delighted to answer your questions or respond to your comments. I think for the record of this evening, we need to speak into the microphone. If, however, you want to say something that you think probably shouldn't kind of go onto the record, that's fine too, but in other circumstances, please speak into the microphone and I'll try to bring it to you as you want to speak. Over here. Is this for the public?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Alpa. That was great and great material. Just look forward to reading it. So I had a couple of questions. One was, the shift from kind of the plains and the struggle. Mainly the main cadres were Dalit laborers fighting against kind of oppressive landlords to the Adivasi, kind of to the jungle. And is it really a retreat? I remember, this would have been around 2004, spending time with area commanders. At this time, it would have been People's War. It was before. And they always talked about like Jharkhand is a place where they got funding, but the real class struggle was in Bhojpur, it was the kind of the agrarian struggle. But my sense was that the shift was actually because it was successful. And so kind of by the end of my fieldwork, there had kind of been a stalemate between the kind of Ranveer Sena kind of groups and the Maoist, and so that it maybe shifted more because of the success of the movement in some sense. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and also, I mean, over more recent kind of period, I've seen some of the same kind of Dalits that would have been part of this movement, like becoming enamored with Hindutva and this kind of rise of Hindu nationalism, and that now is such an important thing. And I'm just wondering if you if you have any sense of these people that you spend so much time in, how they're reacting to current kind of events. Is that one on?
I'll go on here. Thanks. You're both great questions. Somvari, who is one of the 5 central characters of the book, she comes as I said, she comes to resent the guerrillas, and eventually, she ends up. I mean, she comes to resent them. She had her pots of mahua, wine making pots, and her haria rice beer pots destroyed by the Naxalite Women's Liberation Front. So they literally marched into her house and they took them out and they stamped on them. And, this was all in aid of liberating Adivasi women, because drinking is apparently very bad, and drinking is what oppresses Adivasi women. Now, this is the standard narrative, Indian narrative on drinking. Men drink, beat up their women, and therefore any production of alcohol, consumption of alcohol in these areas is to be banned. That was the assumption of the Naxalites in these areas, and it was completely misplaced. As I argue in the last part of Nightmarch, because in fact Adivasi drinking practices in these areas were much more egalitarian than the rest of Indian society. Men and women openly drink together. Alcohol is produced and consumed by women. It's made in the home. There's no inhibitions. Drink is sacred. The first drop of alcohol is given to the spirits. So it's very different kind of practices, cultural practices around drinking. So, Samvari was pretty pissed off, but, over time there were a series of other events. Her sister's son, various people in her family, had joined the Naxalites, and she became afraid that her daughter's going to join the Naxalites. Over the period that I was there, she converted to this Hindu religious sect that was fast spreading in the area, which is a basis for also the way in which Hindutva forces were, spreading into these areas. So, so one of the suggestion is, that in the wake of this movement, we are going to see, the spread of Hindutva forces. I think lots of interesting things to be said about that and the comparison between the Naxalites and the spread of the Hindutva and Hindutva forces in these areas. But in general, these areas were not. So the Naxalites were not present in areas which were mission converted, so Christian converted, but also they were not. The Hindutva forces had not really been able to gain entry into the areas that the Naxalites kind of controlled. But I think over time this is going to be a very different story, and I end with Samvari's story to suggest that trajectory. So. To your first question, no, I think that there was a definite analysis and history of the movement that it was state repression. They couldn't stay in those fields in Bhojpur, in Gaya, in the plains. They were just far too exposed. The police repression was brutal, and so I visited many of those areas which were at one time Naxal strongholds. So the overall narrative I got from both previous MCC cadre people and PU people who had obviously reunited with PW was that it was a retreat. We had to retreat. But this retreat was also a positive thing because we have to now have a different kind of strategy for taking over the areas. How do we, different set of tactics. Let's go back to, the rule book. What is it that Mao and Shah were actually teaching us? Actually, you do need, the perfect guerrilla terrain. MCC were already in those kinds of areas. So it was PW that was moving, and this happened both in the Bihar side, but also in the Andhra side. So there too, there was a retreat from the plains into Basta, into Chhattisgarh, into those forests and hills that were Adivasi dominated, and there too, the narrative was, that we have to, we need better terrain.
Just very, very quickly to interject on, I think it's interesting, the second point you make about Adivasis turning actually to Hindu nationalism. Actually, I think in this last general election, I believe I'm right in saying that the share of the Adivasi vote going to the BJP was pretty much the same as the share of the upper caste vote going to the BJP, and only amongst Dalits was the share of the vote going to the BJP very significantly lower. BJP has really done pretty well. Well, the forces of Hindu nationalism have done pretty well in mobilizing amongst Adivasis. Anyway,
from the cities to more rural.
this is becoming too much of a. Have a go.
Hi, I come from the Indian occupied part of Kashmir, and I cannot help but draw a parallel between the guerrilla warfare, which is an asymmetrical war that the Naxalites are up against, arms against the Indian occupation, the Indian state basically, which is the same thing in my homeland, where there's a huge group of pro-freedom freedom fighters who for me are like my brothers, but are termed as terrorists by the Indian occupation and the authoritarian state. Now, it's very hard for me as a scholar to go around and kind of justify to people why these small young boys leave the comfort of their homes and join this warfare and fight oppression like that. So as a scholar, as an anthropology scholar, I'm very interested in asking your opinion about the representation of such marginalized groups, because it's very hard to represent such a group in academic or scholarly circles. I'd really like to know your opinion on that.
Very good question. Would you like to should we take just two or three now? Somebody, thank you, and then
Thank you.
Irene here,
And thank you, Alpha, for the talk and a beautifully written book. Could you tell us more about kinship? Because I think it's a key element in your analysis. And I'm thinking about Colombia and the dissidents from the FARC movement, which is basically also about kinship and all the kinship networks that you have in the Nariño zone.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you. This one, last one over here.
I have two questions, actually. Thank you for your presentation. The first question follows up on the question that was raised, which is about the aspect of writing and ethnography. And I wanted to expand a little bit on the representational dilemmas, especially as it relates to writing about violence. To me, there seems to be a triple representational dilemma. One is, if you write about violence, then you reinforce the image of violence, reinforce this representation of Naxalites as terrorists. But if you don't write about the violence, then you could be accused of whitewashing the violence. And then there's the third dimension to it, which is the position of the academic writing about the violence. And you spent this time with these people, but you have an exit option, right? So despite our best efforts as ethnographers who take positionality very seriously, I do think that academia is a very extractive business, right? The way that we write will, it's never quite an equal exchange. And so I do wonder about how we should navigate these dilemmas. My second question is more a clarification question, which was I didn't quite understand fully the logic of how we get from the Naxalite movement to it being a democratizing force for Adivasis becoming more integrated in the state or in state politics.
We come back to you just a moment, and others.
Yeah.
Alpa, there are three.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
ones. 4 good questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you for these questions. I think a couple of them are related. So I'll just tell you my perspective on this issue. So a lot is being written about this movement, and a lot, it's coming from journalists, it's coming from political scientists, it's coming from people who've spent sometimes no time at all, sometimes a few days, and I find myself to be in a very privileged position, as you suggested, of having spent all this time in the guerrilla strongholds, and I realized that I had this all these incredible stories and a very complicated narrative about what was happening, which was not being represented in any of the positions that were coming out. So you had, you basically had quite a polarizing perspective on this movement. There were either terrorists or they were, romantic rebels, or the middle ground, which is people stuck in between. My own feeling when I came immediately out of this forest back to London was, these people are all being cast as terrorists. So I've got to basically try to show the world that this isn't the case. And, I knew that at the back of my mind that I was being driven by a counter-propaganda agenda, which would actually produce very quick fix representations of the people I had met. The reality was so much more nuanced, contradictory, full of tensions, ironies, and that needed a lot more time to work out. It needed a kind of slow kind of writing. So I actually tried to work out my analysis through a range of kind of academic articles which nobody would most people in this room would probably not be interested in. And then I could have left it at that. And then I thought, what kind of a book will I write? And, I could have written a very scholarly, a very theoretical book, a book in a language that couldn't be accessible to anybody else but my own colleagues. And But, the stories of Gyanji, Vikas, what happened to them after I came back? Gyanji was arrested. Vikas was turned into a gang, and then he was out to kill Gyanji, and then he was himself killed by the Naxalites. Kohli disappeared. Somvari spent time in prison. And this was the story of so many people I knew. So, so many lives were at stake, and I felt that I had to write a story which could be read by as many people as possible, that would reach an Indian middle class in as wide a way as possible, to try and to reveal a world which was not being revealed, which was not being disclosed through other representations. So I felt that it was actually my scholarly responsibility to write in a way. The book is written so that it can be accessible to anybody. It's not just for an academic audience. I don't know if this addresses some of your issues. But the issues like how to do that without making the scholarly analysis, without dumbing it down in any way. So that was like my big challenge: how to make the complexity of all of that research available to everyone. Of course it's never an equal relationship. You're never assuming that. And much of the critique I have of the Naxalites, you worry, oh well, of course you're harming the people. This book is at one level very sympathetic to the Naxalites, but at another level it's a damning critique of the movement. And you have to remember that movements like this are extremely secretive, and they are also like very, there's debate going on all the time within them. And many of the things, my analysis, the things that I say, they're not news to people within the movement, but they themselves can't say it themselves. So sometimes it's also important, for outsiders who have had the experiences to have the independence to say that. I see, our responsibility as intellectuals. Noam Chomsky writes about this, really well in his piece, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, that we are in a very privileged position because we have the power, the capacity, the resources, the time to do this kind of research, to expose, injustices, to show hidden truths. And, I see that, that responsibility that Noam Chomsky sets out is a responsibility that I think that many of us take to heart. And that is some of the responsibility that is driving the writing of a book like Nightmarch in the way it's written. About violence, I mean, you can worry endlessly about, anybody working on violence, the first thing they worry about is, I don't want to turn this into a pornography of violence, that's the last thing you want to do. And I think it helps very much to think about it theoretically. So I found people like Philippe Bourgois really useful in thinking about violence, because he shows, the structural violence, like the violence that you can't see, how that is really important to everyday experience of violence, not just in terms of the daily inequalities and oppressions, but also the kinds of tensions that work between individuals, within families, how people turn against each other. And, this isn't necessarily violence with guns. This is a kind of everyday violence that exists alongside, the violence with guns. And Nightmarch is a story that tries to show all of these different dimensions of violence, which are present everywhere around us, including in this room, so we cannot ever avoid the question of violence. And if we do in our daily lives, it's because we're blind to it. So, it's there in all of our writings, whether we acknowledge it or not. Kinship, it's hugely important to the book, to the analysis of the book, because what I'm trying to show is as you know, is how the guerrilla leaders are able to, over time, because of the way in which they treat people as equal human beings, have been able to become people's sisters and brothers. And eventually, over time, people married into the guerrilla armies. And, they had children in the guerrilla armies. And then when they had children, they had to leave the guerrilla armies. And so, but then when they left, they remained supporters. And so these kinds of networks grew in and out of the armies over time. But one of the other things I argue is that, in all families, you also have tensions, you also have, lots of infighting, and these same tensions, these same problems also then emerge within the guerrilla armies, which also break them up from inside. So it's like a kind of, as I call it, I think an Achilles heel in the book. There was one other question. No.
But I think that Irene's second question was about
democratization.
Democratization. I don't know whether you can answer.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that quickly. So these areas, these forests and hills, over the time I've known them. When I first went there, the Adivasis I lived with in this village, when a state jeep would come into the area, whether it was like a forest officials or whether it was like block development officers, people would just run into the forest. They just literally leave their houses and then go and hide in the forests. And that's because they were so afraid of the state. So in these areas, the state hadn't had the same kind of presence as it had had in many other parts of India. But what I'm arguing in Nightmarch is that the Naxalites actually raised many campaigns. They raised campaigns for the state to function better, for the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which was, run by the state, to provide 365 days of work rather than the 100 days it provided. They demanded things of the state. And through those movements that the Naxalites created, they actually raised much greater awareness about people wanting things from the state, and in that process enabled people to be a part of the state. So what I'm saying is that the processes of democratization into the state spread as a result of the Naxalites. People, many people who had joined the Naxalites eventually ended up fighting. Guerrilla leaders became, tried to fight for elections, gain seats, and so this is what I'm trying to show. Yeah.
I think you were very keen to answer questions. And one here beside you as well.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering what led you to choose this subject, and how did you get research permit from the state?
Think you want to respond to that?
Yeah, maybe later. No, I had a research visa for my first work. And I was also operating as a journalist. I made some programs for the BBC Radio 4 while I was there. In my second stint, and what made me, my work has always been driven by inequality and attempts to address it, and this. I've looked at various kinds of measures, whether it's development measures coming from the state or whether it's indigenous rights, social movements trying to work on behalf of Adivasis, and the big mismatches between what people think they're doing and what's happening on the ground, and I guess it was natural, really, because these people were on the doorstep of the areas where I was working, and they were essentially the greatest movement against inequality. You know, they were seeking to eliminate it entirely for a more communist vision of an eventual world. So not communism as it existed in the Soviet Union or in China, but the kind of ideal of a society that we've never seen yet is yet to come. You know, and that's what they were driven by, and so. You know, that to me, and the fact that so many Adivasis were joining them, that was, you know, I felt I really needed to understand what was going on, and yeah, that's why I did the research.
First of all, thank you so much for the amazing talk. So I come from India, and I've lived there for the first 19 years of my life. I come from the northwestern part of India, from Punjab. And so I'm a computer scientist. I am not the most up-to-date person on the political scene in India and the reforms happening, the issues in India. But I did follow news when I was back in India and even now. So what I've noticed is that these issues, especially what you have portrayed in your book, are not really represented by the mainstream media, as you just mentioned. And I would like to know the reason why that is. Because during my teenage years, I've seen that most people are ignorant about what's happening in especially the northeastern part of India, talking about the people in the northern or northwestern part of India. So I would like to know if you might have something to say about that.
Is anybody over there? Good.
I just wanted to first say thank you for the presentation, and I've read the book and I've enjoyed it very thoroughly. And I have two questions. The first one being, in the book there's a part where you're going to bathe, and there's a few girls around you, and they make a comment about the type of soap that you would like, and they say, I'm not sure what the first brand is, but the second is Dove, and you then go and say that you were kind of taken back as they were clearly making an assumption based on your caste of what you would need. And I was curious if there were other instances throughout your time living with the Naxalites where that disbalance between the idea of being an egalitarian society and striving for equality in contrast with comments like that. And then my second question is more of a technical one, and that's the process of your field notes during the Nightmarch.
So thanks for the great questions. Field notes, you know, I'm very diligent about field notes. So, you know, I always advise my students to write everything up, everything you possibly can remember. Spend at least 4 hours a day writing your field notes. And, you know, I religiously try to follow that myself. But over the course of the march, I couldn't write at all. So, and it was not for quite a while afterwards that I was able to write. One thing that you kind of, I guess you because you know you have to remember, you develop this ability to remember things for the writing of field notes in a way that I wouldn't know how to write field notes about what happened to me yesterday. You know, I can't remember what happened yesterday, but when you're in the field, you know, you do. And I'm sure, you know, many, you know, other anthropologists in this room will have been in situations where you've been at very intense festivals which take place over a 10-day period where, you know, you just can't get your notebook out, and you can't have the space because you're always surrounded by people. And in those moments, I think you have to draw on the resources that you've developed over time, the ways of remembering that can enable you to maybe come back to your field notes. Yeah. So more generally with field notes, lots of issues to consider. But yeah, the Dove, it was basically Lifebuoy soap. You know, everybody had a bar of Lifebuoy soap, and that's the cheapest soap in India, and you're basically to use that. And I was being asked whether I'd like to use Dove because. Yeah, they could. I use that as a way to show my own reflection. That no matter, I still couldn't get rid of my privileged upbringing. There were still assumptions that were being made. And yeah, as you'll know from the reading Nightmarch, that there were kind of lots of instances of that kind of interaction where you see the inequalities that are taking shape, not just with me, but also within the guerrilla armies. And for me, it was not just about caste, but also the gender inequalities, which I focus on a lot. It was one major part of the book. So although women are supposed to be the same as men, ultimately Seema, who is one of the women's leaders, she's complaining about being in the same camp that I ended up in, where women have to sleep separately to men, and therefore are left out of some of the main conversations. And there are lots of instances like this which I use in the book to try and draw out what is on the one hand the kind of theory of it, but what on the other hand is, the practice, which is quite contradictory. Yeah, thanks. It's the same story as it is everywhere. The media, the dominant press is controlled by, powerful business and also to a certain extent the state. And so it's normal that in such situations you get a story which is quite a partial story of what's happening in these regions. Yeah.
Thank you. I think with apologies to those who were only able to arrive just now, I think we should, Alpa, give you a little bit of a break. Because as you're probably aware, poor Alpa's really got a pretty awful cold as well as jet lag. Isn't terribly well. So you've done tremendously well. We've been very, very privileged to have had you here this evening, and to have had heard such a wonderful presentation.
Oh.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all for coming. So just to say thanks to everybody. Thank you so much for coming on a Friday evening. Yeah, and yeah.